On his 18th birthday, a young man is evicted by his stepmother and given the keys to his estranged grandfather's derelict gunsmith shop, a place he's told is a worthless burden. But what he discovers inside the dusty workshop isn't just about guns, it's about a hidden legacy of sacrifice and a choice that will redefine his entire life. If you've ever felt lost, cast out, or handed a future you didn't ask for, maybe this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button if you feel me, because we're going to get through this together. The clock on the microwave read 7:03 a.m. My 18th birthday had officially begun 3 minutes ago. Carol was already waiting for me in the hallway, her arms crossed. She wasn't holding a cake. She was holding a single, medium-sized cardboard box. My name, Leo, was written on the side in black marker, in her sharp, impatient handwriting. For 2 years, since my dad's funeral, that box had been my unofficial status in this house. Temporary, packed, ready to go. I just hadn't known the exact date of my departure. Now I did. "Happy birthday," she said. The words were flat, stripped of any warmth. They were a legal statement, not a celebration. "You are now an adult. My services are no longer required. Everything you own should be in there. I did a final sweep of your room." I looked from her face to the box. I didn't have much. Some clothes, a few worn paperbacks, a framed picture of my dad and me at a lake when I was 10. My entire life reduced to what could fit in a container meant for shipping office supplies. I felt a strange numbness, a thick layer of cotton between me and the world. It wasn't shock. It was the grim acceptance of something I'd been anticipating for 730 days. "Okay," I said. My voice was rough. I hadn't spoken yet today. She nodded, relieved that I wasn't going to make a scene. Carol hated scenes. She liked things tidy, emotionally and physically. I was a loose thread she was finally able to snip. She reached into the pocket of her pristine white robe and pulled out a small, rust-eaten iron key attached to a brittle piece of twine. She dropped it into my hand. It was cold and heavy. "That's your inheritance," she said, a faint, bitter smile playing on her lips. "From your grandfather, the keys to his old workshop. It's all in your name now, been held in trust. The deed, the tax bills, everything. My lawyer will be forwarding the paperwork." She paused, letting the weight of the word bills land. "Frankly, it's a relief to be rid of it. It's nothing but a falling down shack in the middle of nowhere. A tax burden. You'll probably have to sell it for pennies just to cover what's owed on it." My grandfather, the gunsmith, a man I'd never met, a man my father refused to talk about. After my dad passed, Carol had spoken of him only in dismissive tones, painting him as a reclusive, difficult man who had broken my father's heart. The shop, according to her, was his final, useless monument to a wasted life. "There's a bus ticket in the box," she added, turning toward the living room. "One way. It leaves in an hour. I'd suggest you don't miss it." That was it. No long goodbye. No good luck. Just a box, a rusty key, and a bus ticket to a place I'd never been. I stood there in the hallway of the house I'd grown up in, a house that had ceased to be my home the moment my father's heart stopped beating. I picked up the box. It was lighter than I expected. I walked to the front door, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet house. I didn't look back. I knew what I would see. Nothing. Just a clean, empty space where I used to be. The door clicked shut behind me, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place as final as a gavel. I was standing on the sidewalk in the pale morning light, the city already humming with its usual uncaring rhythm. Cars rushed by. People walked to work, their faces set with purpose. I was 18 years old. I was an adult. I was homeless. And all I had to my name was a box of memories and a key to a place described as worthless. I looked down at the key in my palm. It felt less like a key and more like an anchor, threatening to pull me down into a past I didn't even know. But it was all I had. The only direction left to go was forward, into the heart of that mystery. The curb was cold through my thin jeans. I sat down next to the box, the city's morning unfolding around me like a movie I wasn't in. A sanitation truck groaned past, its mechanical arm grabbing a bin and emptying it with a crash. A woman in a business suit gave me a wide berth, her eyes flicking over my box with a look of mild distaste. I was part of the urban landscape now, an obstacle to be navigated. The numbness I'd felt in the hallway was beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fear that pricked at my lungs with every breath. Where do I go? What do I do? The questions were huge and formless. I pulled open the flaps of the cardboard box. On top of my folded clothes sat a thin white envelope. I picked it up. Inside was a bus ticket and two $50 bills. $100. Carol's severance package. Enough to keep me from starving for a week or two, and just enough to get me out of her city, out of her life. The destination on the ticket read, Creek's End. The name sounded fictional, like something out of a folksy novel, a place where time had slowed to a crawl. The departure time was in less than an hour. I thought about just not going. I could take the $100, find a shelter, try to get a job. I could throw the rusty key into the nearest storm drain and sever the last, tenuous link to a family history that seemed to be nothing but estrangement and disappointment. My father had run away from that place, from that man. Why was I being sent back? It felt like a cruel joke, being forced to walk back into the past he had so desperately tried to escape. I remembered one of the few times he'd ever mentioned his father. I was about 12, and we were working on my Pinewood Derby car for Cub Scouts. My dad was not a handy person. He was a librarian, a man of words and quiet contemplation. He was struggling to carve the block of wood, his hands clumsy with the small knife. I had asked, "Didn't Grandpa teach you how to do this stuff? Wasn't he like a master craftsman or something?" My dad's hands had gone still. A shadow passed over his face, a look I couldn't decipher then, but recognized now as deep, unresolved pain. "My father and we didn't see eye to eye on what it meant to build things, Leo," he'd said softly. "He worked with steel and wood. I work with ideas. Some things don't translate." He'd put the knife down and suggested we just paint the block of wood and hope for the best. We never spoke of it again. Now, sitting on the curb, that memory felt different. It wasn't just about a disagreement over careers. It was a fundamental break, a chasm, and Carol was sending me right to the edge of it. Was she just washing her hands of me, or was there a more subtle cruelty at play? Was she sending me to fail where my father had fled, to be consumed by the same legacy? The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But underneath it, something else was stirring, a stubborn spark of defiance. Carol had called the shop a worthless burden. She had dismissed my grandfather as a failure. But she didn't know him. I didn't know him. All I had was her bitter, second-hand story. My father had left, yes, but he had never explained why. He had only left a silence, a void where a grandfather should have been. I looked at the key again. It was old-fashioned, ornate in a simple, functional way. It was a key to a story I didn't know the ending to. Maybe it was a story of failure and debt, just as Carol said. Maybe I would get to Creek's End and find a collapsed pile of rotten wood with a condemnation notice nailed to the door. But it would be my pile of rotten wood, my failure, not hers. And what was the alternative? Staying here, in a city that had already forgotten me. The $100 wouldn't last. The shelter would be a temporary stop on the way to, what? A life of drifting, of being unseen? For the first time, the idea of Creek's End didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a destination, a blank page, A terrible, frightening, and maybe even necessary blank page. I folded the $50 bills and tucked them deep into my pocket. I stood up, hoisted the box onto my shoulder, and started walking toward the bus station. The weight of the box felt different now. It wasn't just the burden of my past. It was everything I had to build a future with. The bus ride was a long, humming purgatory. I'd found a seat by a window, smeared with the greasy residue of 100 foreheads. For the first hour, the landscape was a familiar blur of concrete, strip malls, and sprawling suburbs. Then, gradually, the buildings thinned out. The 4-lane highways gave way to 2-lane country roads. The manicured lawns of suburbia were replaced by wide, unkempt fields, skeletal trees, and the occasional rusted-out pickup truck sinking into a patch of weeds. The world outside the window was turning gray and brown, the colors of late autumn bleeding into the promise of an early winter. I leaned my head against the cool glass, the vibration of the engine a constant drone in my bones. I didn't listen to music. I didn't read. I just watched the world go by and let my thoughts drift. For 2 years, I had lived in a state of suspended animation. After Dad died, the house filled with a silence so loud it felt like a physical presence. Carol moved through it with a brittle efficiency, cleaning and organizing, erasing the comfortable clutter of my father's life. She never spoke about him. It was as if acknowledging his absence was too messy, an inconvenience to her orderly world. I became a ghost. I ate my meals alone in my room. I did my homework. I kept my head down. I tried to take up as little space as possible, to be as little of a burden as I could. But I was a constant reminder of a life she had married into, a life that had ended abruptly and left her with a teenage stepson she had never really wanted. Her resentment was a low-frequency hum in the house, always present. Being kicked out wasn't a surprise. It was an inevitability, like a tide finally reaching the shore. The bus wheezed to a stop in a small town with a water tower and a single blinking traffic light. A few people got on, their faces weathered and unfamiliar. They spoke in low murmurs, their accents different from the sharp, clipped tones of the city. We were moving into another world, one with its own rules and rhythms. I thought about my grandfather, the gunsmith. The word itself felt archaic, like blacksmith or farrier. It conjured images of fire and steel, of patient, calloused hands and the sharp smell of oil. It was a world away from my father's life of books and quiet archives. What kind of man chooses that life? What kind of man becomes so estranged from his own son that he dies without ever meeting his grandson? Carol's words echoed in my head. A falling down shack. A tax burden. She made it sound like a curse. But my father's silence on the subject felt heavier. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper. Pain. Fear. Was he afraid of his father? Or for him? As the afternoon light began to fade, the bus made a sharp turn onto an even smaller road, winding through dense forests of pine and bare-branched oak. The sky was a low, oppressive sheet of gray. A light, misty rain began to fall, streaking the dirty window and blurring the already bleak landscape. I felt a profound sense of isolation creeping in, the kind that feels physical, a weight on your chest. I was heading toward a place no one wanted, a legacy of ruin left by a man no one seemed to miss. The flicker of defiance I'd felt on the curb had dwindled, replaced by a dull dread. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bus slowed. The driver, a portly man with a kind, tired face, glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Creek's End," he announced to the mostly empty bus. "This is you, son." I grabbed my box and walked to the front. The hydraulic doors hissed open, revealing a single, desolate bus stop. A faded green bench under a small, leaky shelter. Across the street, a handful of storefronts were huddled together, their windows dark save for the neon glow of a bar sign that read simply, Tavern. The rain was coming down harder now, a cold, persistent drizzle. "You sure this is where you want to be?" the driver asked, his voice low and concerned. I just nodded, unable to summon the words. He gave me a look that was a mixture of pity and confusion. "All right then. Good luck to you." The doors hissed shut, and the bus pulled away, its red taillights shrinking in the gloom until they vanished around a bend. The sound of its engine faded, leaving behind an almost absolute silence, broken only by the patter of the rain on the asphalt and the distant caw of a crow. I stood under the meager shelter, the cardboard box growing damp in my hands. The air smelled of wet pine needles, damp earth, and wood smoke. It was the smell of a world I didn't belong to. This was Creek's End. This was my inheritance, and I had never felt more alone in my entire life. The town, if you could call it that, was little more than a single main street clinging to the edge of a dark, winding creek. I could hear the water rushing somewhere behind the buildings. Most of the shops were closed, their signs faded by years of sun and snow. A general store, a post office, the tavern, and a few shuttered storefronts with peeling paint. It felt less like a living town and more like a memory of one. The streetlights cast weak, yellow circles on the wet pavement, creating pools of light in the deepening twilight. I asked the bartender at the tavern, a weary-looking woman wiping down a glass, for directions to the old Walker workshop. She looked me up and down, her expression unreadable. "Walker's place?" she said, her voice raspy. "Haven't heard that name in a while." "You family?" "His grandson," I said. She raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something, curiosity, pity, in her eyes. "Well, I'll be old Jed's grandson." She pointed a thumb toward the back door. "It's down the alley, around the back of the hardware store. Sits on its own little plot by the woods. Has for 50 years. Can't miss it. It's the one that looks like it's about to give up." Her description was unnervingly accurate. Tucked away behind the main street, where the town began to fray into wilderness, stood a small, grim-looking building. It was made of dark, weathered wood, with a steeply pitched metal roof that was streaked with rust. A single, grimy window faced the alley, and a faded sign hung precariously from 2 hooks above the door. The paint was mostly gone, but in the dim light I could just make out the words, "Walker and Son, Fine Arms and Repair." The "and Son" part had been painted over with a crude stroke of black, a deliberate and angry redaction. My father's ghost, right there on the sign. The building didn't just look old, it looked heartbroken. The roof sagged in the middle, the front steps were tilted at a dangerous angle, and the whole structure seemed to be leaning slightly, as if tired of standing. Carol's words came back to me. A falling down shack. She wasn't wrong. A wave of despair washed over me. This was a mistake. I should have thrown the key in that drain. But I was here. The rain was soaking through my jacket, and the cardboard box was starting to feel soft in my hands. I had nowhere else to go. With a deep breath, I climbed the rickety steps, which groaned in protest under my weight. I slid the rusty key into the lock. It resisted, grating as I tried to turn it. For a moment, I thought it was the wrong key, or the lock was seized solid. I put my shoulder into the door and gave the key one last desperate twist. There was a loud, complaining clunk, and the door swung inward into absolute darkness. The smell hit me first. It was thick, layered, and ancient. It was the smell of cold, settled dust, of old wood, of solvent and metal. And underneath it all, the clean, sharp, unmistakable scent of gun oil. It was a masculine smell, a workshop smell, but it was also the smell of abandonment. I fumbled along the wall just inside the door, my fingers searching for a light switch. They found a small, toggle-style switch, and I flipped it up. A single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered to life, casting a weak, yellow glow over the room. my breath caught in my throat. It was like stepping into a photograph from 100 years ago. The room was a long, narrow workshop. One wall was covered, floor to ceiling, with tools, each hanging in its own designated spot on a vast pegboard. Wrenches, files, calipers, hammers, drills. 1,000 specialized instruments I couldn't begin to name, all coated in a fine layer of dust but otherwise perfectly organized. The main space was dominated by a massive wooden workbench that ran the length of the room. It was scarred and stained with decades of work. A heavy-duty vise was bolted to one end, and in its jaws it held the stock of a rifle, half carved, the wood shavings still curled on the benchtop below it. It was as if the craftsman had simply put down his tools in the middle of a task and walked away. Shelves along the opposite wall held tins of oil, bottles of chemicals, and neatly labeled wooden boxes of screws, pins, and springs. The floor was raw planking, dark with age. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light, thick as snow. It wasn't a ruin. It wasn't a shack. It was a sanctuary. A perfectly preserved time capsule of a man's life's work. I walked further in, my boots echoing in the stillness. At the far end of the workshop, a doorway led to a small back room. I pushed the door open. This was where he had lived. It was a Spartan space, a narrow cot with a neatly folded wool blanket, a small table with a single wooden chair, a tiny kitchenette with a hot plate and a sink, and a bookshelf filled with technical manuals and worn-out Western novels. It was the room of a man who needed very little. And there, sitting in the exact center of the small table, was a long, cream-colored envelope. My name, Leo, was written on it in a shaky but elegant script. It wasn't Carol's handwriting, it was someone else's. I picked it up. It was addressed not to my grandson, but to me, by name. As if he knew I would come. As if he had been waiting. I sat down in the hard wooden chair, the damp chill of the room seeping into my bones. The single bare bulb in the workshop cast long shadows, making the tools on the wall look like strange, sleeping creatures. The only sound was the gentle drumming of the rain on the metal roof. My hands trembled slightly as I slid my finger under the flap of the envelope and broke the seal. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written on thick, creamy paper. The ink was a faded blue. I unfolded it and began to read. Leo, it began. If you are reading this, then it means I am gone. It also means you have come here, to this place. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for the circumstances that must have brought you to this dusty room. I had hoped for a different life for you, for your father. But hope is a luxury, and I ran out of it a long time ago. The handwriting was difficult at first, the loops and slants of a man from another generation. But as I read, the words began to flow, and a voice I had never heard began to speak from the page. My name is Jedediah Walker. I am your grandfather. I imagine you don't know much about me. Your father, my son Michael, would have seen to that. And he was right to do so. He was right to run from this place, from me. He was trying to protect you, just as I tried to protect him. Protection, I've learned, can look a lot like abandonment from the outside. My eyes stung. The idea that my father's distance was a form of protection, not rejection, was a thought so new and staggering it almost knocked the wind out of me. I was a good gunsmith, Leo. Maybe one of the best. I could make a rifle that would shoot true at 1,000 yards. I could restore a 100-year-old shotgun until it looked like it just left the factory. It was a skill, a craft. I was proud of it. But this town, this part of the country, it has a sickness, an old one. And my skill attracted the wrong kind of attention. People who didn't want rifles for hunting deer. People who needed tools for a different kind of work that happens in the shadows. They came to me a long time ago. They made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Not a threat, not at first. Just a lot of money for a special kind of work. Custom pieces, no serial numbers, things that couldn't be traced. I said no. I was a craftsman, not an armorer for criminals. So they changed their approach. They threatened Michael, your father. He was just a boy then, full of books and dreams, with no interest in this world of grease and steel. He was my weak spot. They knew it. So I said yes. I had to stop reading for a moment. I looked around the workshop at the silent, patient tools. They looked different now. Not just instruments of a craft, but tools of a compromise, a coercion. I built things for them, Leo. Terrible things. And they paid me well for my silence and my skill. Your father grew up in a house paid for with that money. He hated it. He could feel the stain on it, even as a child. He saw the men who came to the shop at night, the ones who never used the front door. He begged me to stop, to go to the police. But I couldn't. These people were not the kind you say no to twice. They were a cancer, woven into the fabric of this whole region. The law was afraid of them, or owned by them. The day he turned 18, your father left. He told me he couldn't live with the blood on my hands. He was right, but he didn't know the whole story. He didn't know I was trapped. We never spoke again. It broke my heart, but I let him go. I wanted him to be free of it, of me. That was the only good thing I ever built. The paper was wrinkled where a drop of water had fallen, or maybe a tear. His or mine, I couldn't tell. I am leaving this place to you because I have no one else. But I am not leaving you a burden. I am leaving you a choice. Your stepmother will think this shop is worthless. Let her. It is better that way. The real inheritance is not the building. It's hidden. Go to the workbench, the big one. At the end, by the vise, there is a floorboard that sits a little higher than the others. Underneath, you will find what I have left you. It is your choice, Leo, no one else's. You can walk away, just like your father did. I will not blame you. Or you can see this through. Forgive me, Jedediah. I folded the letter and placed it carefully back on the table. The room was silent, but my head was roaring. My grandfather wasn't a villain. He was a prisoner. My father hadn't run away from a monster. He had run away from a situation he didn't understand, from a father who was trying to save him in the only way he knew how. The entire foundation of my family's story, the simple, bitter narrative Carol had fed me, had just crumbled into dust. I felt a surge of emotions so tangled I couldn't name them all. Grief for the grandfather I never got to know. A new, deeper grief for my father, who had carried the weight of this misunderstanding his whole life. And anger, a hot, clear anger at the faceless people who had taken my family from me, who had twisted a man's pride in his craft into a weapon against him. I stood up, my legs unsteady. I walked back into the workshop. The bare bulb seemed to hum with a new intensity. The air felt charged. I ran my hand along the surface of the workbench. It was smooth from decades of use, the wood worn into gentle divots and valleys. I could almost feel the phantom weight of his hands, his focus, his quiet desperation. At the end of the bench, near the heavy black vise holding the unfinished rifle, I knelt down. The floorboards were dark and thick. I ran my fingers over them, searching, and then I found it. One board, its edge a fraction of a millimeter higher than its neighbors. It was almost imperceptible, a secret hidden in plain sight. For a long moment, I just knelt there, my hand resting on the board. The letter had given me a choice. Walk away. No one would blame me. The thought was intoxicating. I could find what was under there, and if it was money, I could take it and disappear. I could go to college. I could get an apartment. I could be a normal person. I could leave Jedediah Walker and his dark legacy buried in this forgotten town. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. It was what my father had done. But my father hadn't known the truth. He had left believing his father was a willing participant, a man corrupted by greed. I knew better. I knew he was a man who had sacrificed his own son's love to keep him safe. Walking away now felt like a betrayal, not just of my grandfather, but of my father too. It felt like leaving the story half finished. And what about me? What would I be walking toward? A life built on a secret, on money earned through coercion and violence. I would be just as haunted as my grandfather was, just in a different way. I would be running, just like my father. The cycle would continue. Right now, I know some of you watching might be screaming at the screen. Take the money, kid. Run. And I get it. I really do. The world is hard, and a clean slate is a powerful temptation. Have you ever been at a crossroads like that, where the easy path is right there in front of you, shining and simple, but your gut is telling you to take the rocky, overgrown trail instead? It's a heavy thing to carry, that kind of choice. It defines you. If you're getting what I'm putting down, and if these stories of impossible choices mean something to you, take a second to let me know in the comments. Tell me about a time you chose the harder path. Your story matters too. We build strength by sharing these burdens. I took a deep breath, the dusty air filling my lungs. I wasn't my father. I had a different choice to make because I had a different piece of the story. My choice wasn't just about escape, it was about justice. I looked around the workshop at the silent tools on the wall. They weren't just tools. They were a testament, a silent witness. I had to finish the job. I wedged my fingers into the crack beside the loose board and pulled. It resisted, then came up with a low groan of old wood. Beneath it, nestled in the dark, cool earth, was a heavy, olive-green metal box. The box was military grade, with sturdy latches on the front. It wasn't locked. I lifted it out of the recess in the floor. It was heavy, heavier than I expected. I carried it over to the small table in the back room and set it down with a solid thud. The sound echoed in the quiet space. This was it, the real inheritance. I sat there for a minute, my heart pounding against my ribs. Everything was about to change. I unsnapped the two latches. They sprang open with a sharp, metallic sound. I took another breath and lifted the lid. The inside of the box was divided into two compartments. The one on the left was filled with cash, stacks and stacks of it, bundled in paper bands, $100 bills. I lifted one bundle. It was thick and dense. I couldn't even begin to guess how much was there. Tens of thousands? Hundreds of thousands? It was a staggering amount of money, life-changing money. It was a one-way ticket to anywhere, a full-ride scholarship to a new identity. This was the escape route, the easy choice my grandfather had offered me, laid out in neat, undeniable stacks. I could close the lid, walk out of this shop, and never look back. The thought was so powerful, so seductive, that it made me dizzy. I could be free. But my eyes were drawn to the right side of the box. It contained no money. Instead, it held 3 thick, leather-bound ledgers, a small, ornate brass key, and another, smaller envelope. This one just had the word Leo on it. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. This was the second part of the choice, the hard part. I opened the envelope. The note inside was short, the handwriting even shakier than before. Leo, it said, the money is yours. It's what they paid me. I never touched a dime of it for myself. It is dirty, but it can buy you a clean life. Take it. Run. Be happy. That is all I ever wanted for your father, and it is what I want for you. There is no shame in survival. But if you are still reading, It means you are considering the other inheritance, the ledgers. For 30 years, I kept a record. Every piece I was forced to build, every modification, every transaction. I documented it all. The names they used, the dates, the technical specifications, flaws I secretly built into the firing mechanisms, unique rifling patterns I used that could act as a ballistic signature. It's all in there. It is my confession, and it is their indictment. It is the truth. The key is to a safe deposit box at the Creek's End Savings and Loan. In it, you will find more, corroborating evidence I collected over the years. This is my life's real work, not the guns, but the proof. If you take this path, you will not be safe. These people are powerful and they have long memories. But you will be free in a way money can't buy. You will finish the story. The choice is yours. I'm sorry to have laid this at your feet. Your grandfather, Jed. I put the note down, my breath shallow. I looked from the stacks of cash to the 3 leather-bound books. One represented freedom from the past. The other represented freedom for the future. Not just for me, but for my grandfather's memory. It was the difference between running from the story and finishing it. I pulled one of the ledgers out. The leather was worn smooth. I opened it to a random page. The book was filled with my grandfather's precise, technical script. Diagrams of firing pins, notes on metal composition, dates, and initials. It was a meticulous, secret history of a 30-year war fought by one man in a dusty workshop. This was his real legacy. Not the weapons he was forced to create, but the record he kept, the trap he had been patiently setting for decades. The money was a ghost, a tempting whisper of a life I could have. But the ledgers had weight. They had a voice. They were demanding something of me. They were asking me to be the man my father never knew his own father was. A man who, when trapped, chose not just to endure, but to fight back in the only way he could. I thought of Carol's sneer, a worthless burden. I thought of my father's pained silence. I thought of my grandfather, alone in this shop for 30 years, polishing his tools, filling his ledgers, waiting. He hadn't left me a burden. He had left me a purpose. He had left me a sword. I closed the ledger and placed it back in the box. Then, I reached over and gently closed the lid over the stacks of cash, hiding them from view. I picked up the small brass key and the 3 ledgers. My choice was made. I wasn't going to run. I was going to stay. I was going to fight. I looked around the quiet, dusty shop. It didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like an armory. And I finally knew what I was fighting for. The decision settled in my gut, not with a triumphant bang, but with a quiet, heavy certainty. The fear was still there, a cold undercurrent, but now it had a direction. It wasn't the formless dread of being alone. It was the sharp, focused fear of an impending conflict. I knew I couldn't do this alone. These were not the kind of people you could simply report to the local sheriff. My grandfather's letter had made that clear. I needed someone on the inside, someone who understood the landscape of this place. His first letter had mentioned a name, the only man I ever trusted. I scrambled to find it, my eyes scanning the pages. There it was, at the bottom of a paragraph about the town's decay. If you ever need help, true help, find Alistair Finch. He's a lawyer, the only honest one this side of the mountains. Tell him Jedediah sent you. He'll know what it means. Alistair Finch. The name sounded as old as the town itself. I looked around the Spartan living quarters. There was no phone. Of course there wasn't. My grandfather was a man trying to stay off the grid. I'd have to use the payphone I'd seen outside the general store. I slid the ledgers back into the metal box, but I kept the small brass key, closing my fist around it. The money stayed where it was, a hidden temptation I had to actively ignore. I couldn't risk carrying the ledgers through town. For now, they were safer under the floorboards where they had rested for years. I put the box back in its earthy compartment, replaced the board, and did my best to brush the dust back over it, hiding the seams. Leaving the shop felt different this time. I locked the door behind me, the clunk of the bolt sounding protective rather than final. The rain had stopped, but the air was cold and damp, the sky a bruised purple. The weak streetlights seemed to cast longer, more menacing shadows now. Every darkened alley, every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, felt like a potential threat. My grandfather's warning had turned the sleepy, forgotten town into a stage for a silent war I had just enlisted in. The payphone was exactly where I'd seen it, attached to the wall of the general store, its little booth humming under a fluorescent light that attracted a cloud of moths. It felt like an artifact from another century. I dug into my pocket for a quarter, my fingers brushing against the $100 Carol had given me. It felt like a lifetime ago. I found a tattered phone book hanging by a greasy chain and flipped through the yellowed pages. Finch. There it was. Finch, Alistair, attorney at law. There was an office address and a phone number. My heart hammered as I dialed. It rang 4 times, each one stretching into an eternity. I was about to hang up when a voice answered, gravelly and tired. Finch. Hello? I stammered, my voice sounding young and thin. I'm looking for Mr. Alistair Finch. You found him, the voice grumbled. It's late. What is it? My name is Leo Walker. Jedediah Walker was my grandfather. There was a profound silence on the other end of the line. It was so long, I thought he had hung up. Then, the voice came back, all the weariness gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. Where are you? At the payphone, by the general store. Stay there. Don't talk to anyone. I'm 5 minutes away. Black sedan. The line went dead. The next 5 minutes were the longest of my life. I stood in the little pool of light, trying to look casual, trying not to scan the dark street like a frightened animal. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Was this a mistake? Could I trust this man I'd never met, this name in a dead man's letter? But I had no other cards to play. This was the only move I had. Exactly 5 minutes later, a large, old, but impeccably clean black sedan pulled up to the curb. The passenger door swung open. The man behind the wheel was old, maybe in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a simple, dark suit. He just looked at me, his eyes sharp and intelligent. "Get in, son," he said. His voice was the same one from the phone. I hesitated for a second, then slid into the passenger seat, closing the door. The car's interior was clean and smelled of old leather and paper. He didn't say anything. He just pulled away from the curb and drove. Not down the main street, but up a winding road that led into the hills overlooking the town. We drove in silence for a few minutes before he pulled over at a scenic viewpoint, a small gravel patch with a low stone wall. Below, the lights of Creek's End were a small, lonely cluster in a vast sea of darkness. He turned off the engine, and the silence returned, thick and heavy. "Jed's grandson," he said, more a statement than a question. He studied my face in the dim light from the dashboard. "You have his eyes, that same damn stubborn look." He sighed, a long, heavy sound. "I was his executor. I was the one who made sure the deed was transferred to you. I was hoping you'd just sell the place sight unseen and never come here. It would have been better for you." "He left me a letter," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He left me more than that." Finch nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "The ledgers." It wasn't a question. He knew. He had been waiting, too. "He told me you were the only one he trusted," I said. A flicker of pain crossed the old lawyer's face. Jed and we went back a long way. I knew he was in over his head. I tried to help him, but he was proud. And he was terrified for your father. So he did it his way. The long way. He looked out at the dark woods. He told me about his plan, about the records he was keeping. He said if anything ever happened to him, he was leaving it all to his grandson. He said you'd have a choice to make. Looks like you made it. I want to finish it, I said, the words feeling stronger, more solid, now that I was saying them to someone else. I want to use what he left me to take them down. Finch was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. You understand what you're asking, Leo. These aren't street-level thugs. This is a syndicate. Old, wealthy, and deeply embedded. They have people in law enforcement, in politics. Walking into the local state police barracks with those books would be a death sentence. For both of us. The ledgers would disappear, and so would we. The reality of it hit me with fresh force. This was not a movie. This was dangerous. Then what do we do? I asked. He turned to look at me, his expression grim but resolute. We do it Jed's way. Smart. Quiet. We bypass the compromised levels. We go federal. I have a contact, a man I went to law school with at the U.S. Attorney's Office. He's the real deal. But we have to build an airtight case before we go to him. The ledgers are the heart of it, but we need the corroborating evidence your grandfather mentioned. The contents of that safe deposit box. He put the car in gear. First thing tomorrow morning, we go to the bank. You have the key. The box is in your name now, as your grandfather's heir. We see what he left us. Then, we make a plan. A real one. As we drove back down the hill, I felt a shift inside me. I was no longer just a scared kid who'd been kicked out of his home. I had an ally. I had a mission. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now partnered with a powerful, unfamiliar feeling. Determination. I was my grandfather's grandson, and I was finally starting to understand what that meant. The next few weeks were a blur of quiet activity that stood in stark contrast to the violent secrets we were unearthing. Alistair Finch became my anchor, a calm, pragmatic guide through the labyrinth my grandfather had left behind. The morning after we met, we went to the Creek's End Savings and Loan, a small, stately brick building that looked as though it hadn't changed since the 1950s. The brass key slid smoothly into the lock of the safe deposit box. Inside, we found no riches, but something far more valuable. Microcassette tapes of secretly recorded conversations, photographs of late-night meetings with license plates clearly visible, and a detailed map of the syndicate's network, hand-drawn by my grandfather, connecting names to businesses and properties across 3 states. It was the Rosetta Stone for his ledgers. While Finch began the painstaking process of digitizing the evidence and preparing a formal brief for his federal contact, I returned to the workshop. It was my sanctuary and my responsibility. My first few days were spent simply existing in the space, sleeping on the narrow cot, eating cheap food from the general store. The silence of the place was immense, but it was no longer the silence of abandonment. It felt watchful, patient. Then, one morning, I decided to clean. It started small. I found a broom and swept the thick layer of dust and wood shavings from the floor. The simple, repetitive motion was calming. As I cleared the floor, the raw, beautiful planking underneath was revealed. It felt like I was sweeping away not just dust, but years of neglect and sorrow. I was letting the place breathe again. The task grew. I took a soft cloth and began to wipe down the tools on the pegboard. Each one was a small, perfect piece of engineering. As I cleaned the grime from a set of calipers or a finely toothed file, I felt a connection to the hands that had used them. my grandfather's hands. I wasn't just cleaning objects, I was paying respect to a lifetime of skill and dedication. I found a can of oil and began to lubricate the moving parts of the drill press and the lathe. The machines, dormant for years, began to move with a quiet, fluid grace. I was slowly, carefully, bringing the workshop back to life. One afternoon, while cleaning out the drawers of the main workbench, I found more than just screws and springs. Tucked in the back of one drawer was a small, tattered photo album. The pictures were old, black and white. There was my grandfather, a young man with the same stubborn eyes Finch had mentioned, standing proudly in front of the newly built shop. There were pictures of him with a woman I assumed was my grandmother. And then, there were pictures of a little boy with blonde hair and a serious expression. My father. I saw my dad as a toddler, holding a comically large wrench. As a boy of about 10, sitting on the workbench, watching his father work, his face a mixture of awe and confusion. And the last photo, a Polaroid, was of my father as a teenager, standing by the door, a backpack on his shoulders, his face tight with anger and hurt. My grandfather wasn't in the picture, but I knew he was the one holding the camera. It was the moment he left. Seeing it captured, a frozen instant of heartbreak, made it all real in a way the letter couldn't. I spent hours with that album, piecing together the family history I'd been denied. This workshop wasn't just a building. It was the only family archive I had. It held the evidence of a crime, but it also held the evidence of a life, of love and pride, and terrible, heartbreaking choices. As I worked, I began to reflect on the idea of inheritance. Carol had thrown the word at me like an insult, a worthless tax burden. She saw it only in terms of money, of assets and liabilities. But she was wrong. My real inheritance wasn't the building, and it certainly wasn't the blood money hidden under the floor. It was the ledgers. It was the responsibility. It was the chance to reclaim my family's name, to finish the story my grandfather had started. It was the quiet dignity of this workshop, the integrity of the tools, the silent testimony of a man who refused to be broken. The money under the floorboard remained a secret between me and my grandfather's ghost. I didn't need it. I was surviving on the last of Carol's $100 and a small advance Finch had given me, insisting it was an expense against the estate. Living in the back room was free. My needs were simple. For the first time in my life, I felt rich in a way that had nothing to do with cash. I had a purpose. One evening, Finch called me on the shop's newly installed landline. His voice was grave. "It's time, Leo. The package is ready. My contact is expecting us. We leave tomorrow, before dawn." A cold wave of fear washed over me, but I pushed it down. I looked around the clean, organized workshop. The single bulb overhead cast a warm, golden light on the oiled steel of the tools and the polished wood of the workbench. It was no longer a derelict shack. It was my home, and I was ready to defend it. Carol kicking me out hadn't been a curse. It was the single greatest gift I had ever received. It had sent me on a journey not to a worthless property, but to the very heart of who I was meant to be. The victory, when it came, was quiet. There were no dramatic courtroom showdowns, no car chases, no shootouts in the rain. It happened the way my grandfather had lived the last 30 years of his life, methodically, patiently, and in the shadows. Finch and I drove for 6 hours to a sterile, anonymous federal building in a city I didn't recognize. We met his contact, a sharp, no-nonsense woman from the Department of Justice, in a small, windowless conference room. For hours, Finch laid out the case, presenting the ledgers, the photos, the recordings. I sat beside him, the silent, living proof of Jedediah Walker's legacy. The woman listened without interruption, her face unreadable. When Finch was done, she looked at the evidence, then at me. Your grandfather was a brave man, she said, her voice even, and a meticulous one. This is comprehensive. She closed the folder. We'll take it from here. Go home, Mr. Walker. Lie low. You'll hear from us. And that was it. We drove back to Creek's End in silence. The waiting was the hardest part. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The winter settled in, blanketing the town in snow. I kept working in the shop, learning the tools. I bought books on woodworking and metalsmithing. I started with simple things, repairing a broken chair for the woman who ran the tavern, sharpening blades for the local butcher. I wasn't a gunsmith, not yet. I was just a man learning a craft, feeling the satisfying heft of the tools in my hands, the pleasure of making something broken whole again. The news came in dribs and drabs through clipped phone calls from Finch, a series of quiet arrests, assets being seized. A few key figures, pillars of the community in nearby counties, suddenly retiring or moving away. The syndicate wasn't blown up. It was dismantled, piece by piece, its roots systematically poisoned by the truth my grandfather had so carefully cultivated. The cancer was being cut out, not with a bang, but with the quiet, precise work of a surgeon. One spring afternoon, Finch showed up at the shop holding a newspaper. The headline was about an obscure state senator resigning due to health reasons. He pointed to the name. It was one of the top names from the ledgers. "It's over, Leo," he said, a rare smile touching his lips. They got them. They got them all. We stood there in the workshop, the afternoon sun streaming through the now clean window. I felt not a surge of triumph, but a profound sense of peace. A deep, quiet rightness. We had done it. My grandfather's war was finally over. That evening, I pulled up the loose floorboard for the first time in months. The metal box was still there. I opened it and looked at the stacks of cash. The easy way out. The escape route I hadn't taken. I knew what I had to do. The next day, with Finch's help, I set up a trust fund. The money, laundered through a life of crime, would now be used to fund vocational scholarships for kids in the region who, like me, needed a second chance. Kids who wanted to learn a trade, a craft. The Jedediah Walker Foundation. His name would no longer be associated with the weapons he was forced to build, but with the futures he could help create. I decided to stay in Creek's End. I decided to keep the shop. I hung a new sign out front. It was made of polished oak, and I'd carved the letters myself. It read, Walker and Grandson. I was reclaiming the name, restoring the son that had been so angrily painted over. This place was my home now. The town, once so alien and intimidating, had slowly accepted me. The locals would nod as I passed. The bartender would save me a seat at the end of the bar. I was no longer an outsider. I was Jed Walker's grandson, the boy who had come home and cleaned up the old shop. My story began with being thrown away, with a door closing and a rusty key being dropped in my hand. It started with the belief that I had inherited something worthless. But I was wrong. Inheritance isn't just about money or property. It's about the stories we're given, the legacies we're entrusted with. It's about the choices we make when faced with the easy wrong and the hard right. My grandfather left me the truth and the courage to use it. He taught me that a home isn't just a roof over your head. It's a place where you have a purpose. It's a place you are willing to fight for. This journey taught me that sometimes the worst day of your life is actually the first day of your real life. Being cast out forced me to find out who I was and what I was made of. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to find your own strength in the face of loss, or redefine what family and home mean to you, please subscribe and become part of this community. We're all just trying to make sense of the stories we've been handed. Share your own story of finding an unexpected home or a hidden purpose in the comments below. I promise you, I read every single one, because every one of our stories deserves to be heard. and you are not alone. Thank you for listening.